There are nights when the mind simply will not quiet. You lie in the darkness, ready for sleep, and yet the thoughts keep coming, worries about tomorrow, replays of yesterday, plans half-formed, regrets half-released. The mind moves and moves, like water that cannot find its level. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion you wonder, will it ever stop? This is an ancient question. People in every age, in every tradition across the long human story, have sat with racing minds and wondered the same thing. And in the mountains of Korea, in the forests of Thailand, in the cave monasteries of Tibet, in the great Chan halls of China, teachers looked at this very experience, the mind that rushes, the thoughts that rise and fall, and discovered something astonishing. The mind's movement, they said, is not the problem. It is the watching of that movement that sets you free. Tonight, we journey through 8 stories from the Buddhist traditions of Asia, Korean Seon hermits who held a single question like a burning coal, Thai forest monks who walked barefoot through tiger jungles, learning to see the mind clearly, Tibetan masters who found pure awareness beneath every thought, Chinese Chan teachers whose one gesture could open a student's eyes. These stories are offered as contemplative companions for your rest, philosophical reflections and ancient wisdom, not medical or therapeutic guidance, but something quieter, company for the night. If you drift off before the last story, that is perfect. You don't need to stay awake to receive what is offered here. The river flows whether you watch it or not. Settle your body now. Feel the weight of the blanket, the coolness or warmth of the air on your face. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the breath find its natural rhythm. You have arrived. The river of the mind is already flowing. All that remains is to sit on the bank. In the autumn of 1879, in the mountains of Korea's Chungcheong province, a young monk sat alone in a locked room and tried to stop thinking. His name was Song Dongguk, though his Dharma name was Gyongho, meaning mirror of emptiness, and he had been the most celebrated lecturer in all of Korean Buddhism. From the age of 9, he had lived in monasteries, studying the great texts with a mind that absorbed sutras the way dry air absorbs rain. By the time he was 24, students traveled days on foot to hear him speak. He could explain the Diamond Sutra, the awakening of faith, the Platform Sutra of the 6th Patriarch, as easily as most men recite their own names. Other monks bowed when he passed. Temple abbots saved the highest seat for him. None of that mattered now. 3 months earlier, Gyongho had been walking south through the autumn countryside toward the village of Naju to visit his old teacher, and he had stopped at a farming village whose name he did not know. The village was quiet in the wrong way, the silence of doors kept shut, of smoke that rose from no chimney. He knocked, and no one answered. He pushed open a gate and found a courtyard empty except for a pile of straw and a dog that did not bark. In the next courtyard, he found bodies. Cholera had passed through like a river, finding the lowest ground. An entire village. Children, grandmothers, the young men who had walked behind ox plows since boyhood. All of them gone in days. Gyongho stood in that courtyard for a long time. He had memorized the passage from the Vimalakirti Sutra where the wise layman explains that illness is the condition of all sentient beings. He had lectured on impermanence before hundreds of students. He had explained, in careful and elegant language, the Buddhist teaching that all formations are unstable, that death arrives without announcement, that clinging to the body is the root of suffering. He had understood all of this as ideas. Standing in that courtyard, surrounded by the smell of death and the unnatural stillness of an autumn afternoon, he understood something else. He had no idea what to do with any of it. The words he had memorized did not help him. The elegant explanations had no weight here. He had spent 20 years collecting knowledge about the mind, and he did not know his own mind at all. He walked on, but something had broken open in him. Or perhaps something had broken, closed the comfortable certainty that understanding and knowing were the same thing. When he returned to the monastery at Donghaksa, he gathered his students together and told them to go home. He said this plainly, without ceremony. Then he went to a small room at the far end of the compound, closed the door from the inside, and did not come out. The room was perhaps 4 paces wide and 4 paces long. A sleeping mat, a small window high on the wall, too high to look out of, that let in a rectangle of sky that changed color through the day. A bowl of barley water that a junior monk left outside the door each morning. That was everything. He had been given a hwadu, one of those strange, burning questions that Korean Seon teachers use not to answer, but to work on the mind, like a stone grinding another stone into fine powder. His hwadu came from an old exchange. A monk had asked a teacher, even if you became a cow, there would be no hole to make a nostril. What is this? Gyongho did not try to answer this question. The purpose of a hwadu is not to be answered. Its purpose is to hold you. It sits in the center of the mind like an ember, and if you attend to it faithfully, it grows warm, then hot, then burning. But first there was the thinking. In that small room, with nothing to do, with no students to teach, no texts to consult, no visitors to receive, Gyongho discovered that his mind was extraordinarily loud. It had always been active, brilliant, productive, generating understanding after understanding, but he had never before sat still long enough to simply watch it. Now he had nowhere else to go. The thoughts were extraordinary in their variety. He thought about the cholera village, revisiting every detail. He thought about the faces of his students and wondered what they were doing. He thought about his mother, who had brought him to a monastery as a child after his father died, who had slept outside the temple gate for 3 nights before the abbot agreed to take the boy in. He thought about the correct interpretation of a particular passage in the Huayan Sutra that he had never quite resolved. He thought about whether the barley water each morning was enough. He thought about whether he was doing this correctly. He thought about thinking about whether he was doing it correctly. He observed all of this. This was the thing that surprised him most. He had expected to find, in meditation, some way to stop the thoughts, to quiet the mind into the stillness he had read about in the texts. Instead, what he found was that the watching itself had a different quality than the thinking. The thoughts came and went, sometimes slowly, like clouds moving across the small rectangle of sky in his window, sometimes rapidly, tumbling over one another in floods. But there was something that watched them that did not move. He could not say what this was. He was not skilled enough yet to trust the observation. He put it aside and returned to the hwadu. Weeks passed. The rectangle of sky went from amber autumn light to the pale gray of early winter. He could hear, faintly, the monastery bells at dawn and dusk, the footsteps of monks crossing the courtyard, the crows that gathered in the bare trees. These sounds came to him as if from very far away, as if he were at the bottom of a deep, still lake, and all the ordinary world moved on the surface above. The hwadu burned, He carried it the way a mother carries a sleeping child, carefully, attentively, never quite putting it down. Even when he slept, it seemed to be there on the edge of awareness. Even when he ate the barley water in the morning, bowing his head over the bowl in the cold, the question was with him. Even if you became a cow, there would be no hole to make a nostril. And then, one morning in the middle of November, another monk's footsteps stopped outside his door. The monk called through the wood, "What does it mean that even if you became a cow, there will be no hole to make a nostril?" He was asking the question as an ordinary question, perhaps testing whether the master inside the locked room had any answer after all this time. Perhaps the junior monk had grown impatient, had decided the great lecturer was simply sitting in there going mad. The words came through the door, and the ground dropped away. Gyongho did not later describe it in any elaborate way. He wrote only that he forgot every phenomenal form, including himself, and that what remained was something he could not name, not because it was mysterious, but because it was so obvious that language slid off it like water off stone. He wrote that it felt as if the billions of teachings he had memorized dissolved at that moment, the way snow dissolves in spring, not destroyed, but returned to their original nature, which was water, which had always been water. He sat for a long time after the monk's footsteps moved away. The rectangle of sky in the window was unchanged. The cold of the floor reached up through the mat. His breath was still visible as white mist in the air. Everything was exactly as it had been. Everything was entirely different. When Gyongho emerged from the room, he did not make a speech. He did not call his students back and announce an enlightenment. He walked to the kitchen, asked for a bowl of rice, ate it, standing at the window, and watched the snow that had begun to fall on the empty courtyard. His student, Mangong, who came to study with him in later years, once asked him what he had discovered in those 3 months in the locked room. Gyongho looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "There was more space between thoughts than I expected. I had spent 20 years filling that space with words. When the words stopped, the space was still there. It had always been there." Mangong thought about this. He said, "Was the space empty?" Gyongho smiled. "When you open a window," he said, "does the wind enter an empty room or a full one?" Mangong did not answer. Gyongho nodded, as if the silence were the correct response. This is the first teaching of watching the mind. Not that thoughts are bad. Not that the mind must be silenced or conquered or made to behave, but that beneath every thought, surrounding every thought, is something that watches spacious, unhurried, not made of words. In Korean Seon, this watching quality is sometimes called the one who knows. Not a separate self, sitting somewhere inside you, observing from above. More like the quality of the sky that allows clouds to appear. The sky does not hold the clouds. It is simply is, and the clouds arise within it. Move, change, dissolve. When your mind is busy tonight, the way Gyongho's was busy in that locked room, when thoughts arrive in waves and you feel as if the thinking will never slow, notice this. There is something that notices the thoughts. The noticing itself is quiet. You have never needed to silence the thoughts in order to touch that quiet. The quiet is already here, already available. The way the sky is available above even the thickest clouds. You don't need to solve anything right now. Not the worry you carried into bed. Not the question you've been turning over all week. The thoughts can continue, the way the river continues. and you can rest on the bank, simply watching. Let your breath slow a little now. Feel the weight of your body settling. Whatever thoughts are moving through your mind in this moment, let them move. They will not carry you away if you do not climb into them. Just rest here. Just watch. And as that recognition begins to settle, the knowing that watching is already rest, we travel now to another time, another mountain, and a very different kind of teacher. In the forest monastery of Wat Nong Pa Pong, in the northeast of Thailand in the early 1970s, a young monk named Susito arrived with a notebook. He had come from Bangkok, where he had worked as a junior teacher at a school, spending his evenings reading philosophy and his mornings riding a crowded bus to work. Watching the faces of other commuters, the exhaustion in them, the distance, the way people could be surrounded by thousands of others and still seem profoundly alone, he had ordained after reading a short pamphlet about the Thai forest tradition, which described meditation practice in language so plain and undecorated that it had startled him. No ceremonies, no elaborate visualizations, no hierarchies of invisible beings. Just this: sit down, watch the mind, see what happens. He had expected silence. What he found at Wat Nong Pa Pong was 400 monks. The crowing of roosters before 3 in the morning, the smell of incense and mud, and a large teacher named Ajahn Chah, who laughed more than Susito had thought saints were permitted to laugh. The monastery had been built in a forest that the local villagers called haunted, a dense grove of dipterocarp trees and teak, full of cobras and the kind of centipedes that swelled a man's hand for 3 weeks. The monks slept in small wooden kutis set among the trees, platforms on stilts with walls of split bamboo, just wide enough for a sleeping mat and a small sitting space. In the rainy season, the air was so wet you could feel it pressing against your skin. In the dry season, the dust was the color of turmeric and rose from the paths in clouds when the monks walked to the dining hall before dawn. Susito's notebook had seemed like a good idea in Bangkok. He had planned to record his insights. The first thing he discovered was that sitting meditation was nothing like he had imagined. He had imagined something peaceful, a settling of the mind into clear water, thoughts becoming fewer and fewer until there was only stillness. What actually happened? The first morning he sat in the long, open meditation hall with the other monks was that his mind became immediately and extravagantly busy. It replayed his last conversation with his mother. It rehearsed things he had said 10 years ago that he wished he had said differently. It wondered what was for breakfast. It invented an entirely fictional argument with a monk he had met only once. It composed a letter of complaint about the roosters. It recited, without his permission, a commercial jingle for a soap powder that had been on the radio in Bangkok. This was alarming. He had assumed that sitting still would produce stillness. He had not accounted for the mind's apparent independence from the body. He tried harder. He brought his attention to his breath, as the elder monks had shown him. Inhale, exhale. The mind returned to the argument, now expanded to include a second fictional monk who agreed with him. He returned to the breath. The mind went to breakfast again, more urgently. He returned to the breath. The mind produced, entirely without context, a detailed memory of a birthday party from childhood, complete with the smell of the garlands his aunt had woven from jasmine and marigolds. After the morning sitting, he went to see one of the senior monks, an older Thai bhikkhu named Phra Anan, who had been at Wat Nong Pa Pong for many years. "My mind will not be quiet," Suchito said. I cannot meditate. Fra Anan looked at him with the particular expression that Thai forest monks sometimes wore, not unkind, but with something in it that suggested the answer was already obvious. Your mind is always like this, the elder said. You simply did not know it before. This was not reassuring. Suchito said so. You traveled by bus in Bangkok, Fra Anan said. On a bus with many passengers? Yes. Did the passengers become quiet because you wanted them to? Suchito considered this. No, but you could still travel. The bus still moved. The destination was still reached. Fra Anan put his hands together and walked away, leaving Suchito standing in the dust of the courtyard with what might have been either a metaphor or an insult. He wrote none of this in his notebook. Several weeks passed. The monastery's days had a structure so regular that it began to feel like a form of breathing, rising at 3, chanting in the hall, sitting, walking meditation on the long paths between the trees, going to the village at dawn for alms food, the one meal of the day eaten in silence, then the long empty afternoon hours that were allocated to practice but felt, in those early weeks, like hours allocated to suffering. Suchito's knees ached. The heat was extraordinary. The centipedes, he confirmed, were real, and his mind continued its productions. But something was beginning to shift, though he could not have named it. In the long afternoon hours, when he sat on the steps of his kuti and watched the light change through the trees, he started to notice something he had not noticed before. The thoughts came, but they passed, not because he pushed them away, not because he achieved some state of superior concentration, but simply because thoughts are impermanent in the same way everything else is impermanent. A thought about the bus arose, stayed for a while, and dissolved. A thought about his mother arose, was vivid for a moment, and softened back into the general movement of the mind. He was not causing this. The arising and passing was simply what thoughts did. This observation, so small it might have gone unnoticed, cracked something open. The real encounter came 6 weeks after his arrival, when Ajahn Chah called all the monks together one evening after the sun had set, in the outdoor meeting space where the moths gathered in clouds around the oil lamps. The abbot sat in his place, cross-legged and unhurried, wearing robes the color of cured saffron. He had a round face and eyes that were simultaneously sharp and warm, the eyes of someone who found the entire situation of being human genuinely, affectionately amusing. A monk had asked him a question about meditation that was really a complaint in question form. Luang Por. My mind will not stop thinking. What should I do? Ajahn Chah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Who told you it should stop? The monk was confused. Is the goal not a silent mind? If you wanted a river to stop flowing, Ajahn Chah said, and you stood in the middle of it and shouted at the water, would the water obey you? The monk acknowledged that it would not. Is the water the problem? Or is the problem that you are standing in the river, fighting it, when you could be sitting on the bank? Watching? He let the silence hold this for a moment, then continued. His voice was low, almost matter of fact, as if he were explaining something entirely ordinary, which he believed he was. There is the thinking mind, he said, and there is what some of us call Puru, the one who knows. The thinking mind is like the river. It moves. It makes sounds. It carries things downstream. The one who knows is like the riverbank. The bank does not fight the river. The bank does not wish the river would slow down or change direction. The bank is simply there, steady, while the river flows past. Someone asked, "How do we find this one who knows?" Ajahn Chah smiled the smile that his students had come to recognize as the one reserved for questions that had answered themselves. "You just used it," he said, "to ask the question." Sutito sat in the back of the assembly and felt something loosen in him. Not enlightenment. He was careful enough about his own mind not to mistake loosening for liberation. But something that had been held tightly released itself, the way a fist opens when sleep finally arrives. He had been trying to fix the thinking. He had been treating his mind as a problem to be solved, a noise to be silenced, a disorder to be corrected. He had arrived at a forest monastery with a notebook to record his progress toward peace, and his mind had responded by producing an endless catalogue of soap jingles and imaginary arguments, which he had interpreted as evidence of failure. What Ajahn Chah was pointing at was something different. Not the absence of thinking, but a relationship to thinking. Not a mind without thoughts, but a quality of presence that could hold thoughts without being consumed by them, the way the forest held the monsoon, bending under the weight of water, but not being uprooted, the roots going deeper than any storm. In the months that followed, Susito learned to walk barefoot on the forest paths before dawn, the damp soil cool and alive under his feet, carrying the awareness of Puru the way he had once carried the notebook as something to return to, a home point. Not a destination to reach, but a quality always already present. The way the sky is always already present, whether or not you happen to be looking at it. His knees still ached. The roosters still crowed at 3 in the morning. The centipedes were still real. The mind still moved. But from the bank, the river was beautiful. Years later, when Susito had become a senior monk himself and was asked by younger practitioners what to do about a restless mind, he would tell them what Fra Anan had told him about the bus in Bangkok. He would watch their confusion, and he would feel a warmth that was almost laughter. And he understood at last why Ajahn Chah had laughed so much. The mind being busy was not the difficulty. The difficulty was believing it should be otherwise. And the moment you stopped believing that, the moment you sat on the bank instead of fighting the river, you discovered that the river had never been your enemy at all. It had simply been flowing, as rivers do, as minds do, as life does, in its own time and its own direction, entirely indifferent to your opinion of it, and entirely, endlessly, available to be watched. Let your breath be slow now. The way breath becomes slow when you are no longer fighting anything. Feel the surface beneath you, the weight of your body, steady and held. Your mind may still be moving. That is completely fine. The moving is not the problem. You are already on the bank. You have always been on the bank. The one who knows has never left. And as that river keeps flowing, gently, beneath your watching, another story finds us now. Further north, further into mountains, where a mind learned something about the thoughts it could not stop thinking. In the early spring of 1573, at the sacred mountain of Wutai in China's Shanxi province, a young Chan monk named Deqing sat on a wooden footbridge and could not stop hearing the river. He had come to Mount Wutai the previous autumn from the great temple complex at Nanjing, carrying letters of introduction and a reputation that made abbots straighten in their seats when they heard his name. He was 27 years old and had been studying Buddhist texts since the age of 11. He could recite the Heart Sutra in a dozen dialects. He had memorized substantial portions of the Avatamsaka, the vast, visionary scripture that describes reality as a net of infinite jewels, each one reflecting all others. He had given talks on the nature of mind that older monks complimented with the particular warmth reserved for those who remind you of your own best understanding. He had come to Mount Wutai because none of this had helped him. The problem was not that he lacked knowledge. The problem was that his mind had too much of it. Every experience he encountered was immediately processed, categorized, stored, cross-referenced with something he had read. He could not watch a sparrow land on a branch without thinking of the sparrow and branch metaphor in the Zhuangzi, then wondering whether that was actually the right comparison. Then recalling two competing interpretations of the passage, then composing in his mind the argument he would make if someone challenged the second interpretation. The sparrow left. Deching had not actually seen it. He had read, in his teacher Yungu's writings, a description of what Chan called Wunian, the mind without sticky grasping thoughts, clear as still water, reflecting without distorting. This was not absence of thinking. Wunian was not blankness. It was more like the clean surface of a mirror present, responsive, accurate, before the dust of habitual reaction settles on it. He wanted to know what it felt like. He had read everything written about it. He had never experienced it. Mount Wutai in early spring was extraordinary. The mountain is one of the 4 sacred peaks of Chinese Buddhism, believed to be the earthly dwelling of Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, and the atmosphere of the place carried something that Deching could feel without being able to name an altitude not just of geography but of quality, as if the air itself had been clarified by centuries of prayer. The snow was still on the high peaks, bright against an evening sky, the color of old silk. The temple bells carried across the valleys in the cold. The pine forests were so still that when a branch released its load of snow, the sound reached him seconds after he saw it fall. He had found the footbridge by accident, following a path that curved away from the main monastery and down toward a narrow gorge where a mountain stream fell through a series of boulders. In the gorge, the sound was tremendous, not a gentle babbling, but a true roar. Water under pressure, finding its way through narrow passages of stone, dropping and churning and dropping again. The spray from the falls hung in the cold air as mist. Deching had sat on the footbridge above the gorge, and something had happened that he could not explain for the first time in years. His mind had gone quiet. Not silent, the water was impossibly loud, but quiet, in the sense that there was no room for the commentary. The sound was too total, too present, too unrelenting for his mind to narrate it or categorize it or compare it to anything. It simply was. He was simply there, hearing it. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Every day for 3 months he walked to the footbridge at dawn, sat in the cold with the roar of water filling him completely, and practiced what his teacher had described as turning the light around instead of pursuing thoughts outward, gently allowing awareness to return to the very act of awareness itself. What he discovered in those months was uncomfortable before it became clarifying. He discovered that his mind had a deep and very refined habit of narrating, not just narrating the present, describing what he saw and heard and felt, but narrating the narration. He would notice a thought arising, and then immediately there would be another thought about the first thought, whether it was a correct thought, whether it aligned with the Huayan understanding of non-dual mind, whether a master he admired would have had a similar thought. His mind commented on its own commenting. It explained its own explanations. It was extraordinarily busy in an extraordinarily subtle way. And because it was his own mind producing these commentaries about Buddhist teachings, he had for years not noticed that this was the problem. The Avatamsaka Sutra, which he loved above all texts, described a jewel net cast across the universe in which every jewel reflects every other jewel perfectly, infinitely. He had understood this as a metaphor for the interconnectedness of phenomena. Sitting on the footbridge, listening to the water, he began to understand something else, that his thoughts operated like a similar net, but a distorted one. Every thought reflected every other thought. And in that reflection, the actual present moment, the actual water, the actual cold, the actual morning became something secondary. The mind's image of experience stood between him and experience itself. This was what the old Chan teachers called proliferating mind. The Pali teachers used the word papanya, which means something like mental elaboration or conceptual proliferation. The mind's tendency to take any simple experience and expand it outward into a web of associations, judgments, fears, hopes, stories. A sound becomes a thought about the sound, which becomes a memory connected to the sound, which becomes a plan related to the memory, which becomes an anxiety about whether the plan is wise, which becomes a self-assessment of one's ability to judge wisely, which becomes somewhere far from the original sound suffering. Deching had been doing this his whole life. He had done it so elegantly, with such sophisticated Buddhist vocabulary, that it had looked like wisdom. One morning in late spring, when the mountain was finally releasing its winter and the first birds were returning to the upper forests, something shifted on the footbridge. He had been sitting for perhaps an hour, the water roaring beneath him, when a thought arose, something concerning a letter he had received from a colleague in Nanjing, a small professional disagreement about the interpretation of a passage, and without any effort or decision, he simply watched it arise, and then watched it pass, and then watched the next thought arise and pass. Not grabbed, not extended, not elaborated into a web of associations. Arising, present for a moment, passing, arising, passing. The water had always been doing this. Water doesn't grab a moment of turbulence and extend it. Water doesn't narrate its own churning. Water simply moves through the shapes it finds, and the shapes change, and the water continues. He remained on the footbridge for a very long time that morning. He wrote later, in his autobiography, that the sound of the water gradually became inaudible not because it stopped, but because the distinction between the hearer and the heard had softened. The way, on a very still lake at dawn, you cannot find the exact boundary between the water and its reflection of the sky. When he walked back to the monastery, the path through the pines was unchanged. The morning light lay in the same angles through the same branches. His feet on the cold earth were the same feet. But the commentary had paused. He understood now what his teacher had pointed at, but never quite said directly, that most human suffering is not caused by what happens to us. It is caused by what the mind does with what happens to us in the seconds and minutes and years afterward, the elaboration, the story building, the adding of judgments and interpretations and fears until the original moment is buried under everything the mind built on top of it. The water falls. That is all. The water does not tell a story about falling. It does not remember the last time it fell, or worry about where it will go next, or compare this falling to falling it has seen described in texts about other water. It simply falls. And in the falling, the pure, uncommented, unelaborated falling, there is something that is not suffering. Deching went on to teach for another 50 years. He carried within him, always, the knowledge of what the footbridge had shown him, not that thinking was bad, not that the mind needed to be emptied or silenced or tamed into blankness, but that a thought touched lightly and released completely is a thought that does not become a story. And the mind that does not turn every moment into a story is a mind that can rest in each moment exactly as it is, cold and bright and full of water sounds, and entirely, quietly, enough. Breathe now. Slowly. Let the breath be like water in that gorge, simply moving, without commentary on its moving. If a thought arises, let it arise. Let it be what it is for a moment, and let it go. You don't need to follow it into the story it might become. The story will wait. The present moment will not. Just this breath. Just this settling wait. Just this quiet. And as the mind's narrating grows softer now, we travel across mountains and centuries to a place where a young woman learned something about the thoughts she was sure she could not release. The climb to Yentu Mountain began before dawn. Lin had left her family's house in the river valley the evening before, when the cooking fires were still lit and the smell of fish broth drifted from every open doorway along the lane. She had told her mother she was going to visit her aunt in the next village. This was not entirely a lie. Her aunt's village was in the direction of the mountain, but she had walked past it in the blue-grey dark of early morning, following the old stone path that curved north and upward through stands of bamboo, so tall they formed a kind of ceiling above the trail, their green-black stalks swaying in the pre-dawn wind with a sound like breath. She was 19 years old and had not slept in 3 weeks. Not truly slept, she dozed. Sometimes, in the late afternoon when exhaustion pressed her down, but the real sleep, the deep, wordless kind that leaves you rested in the morning, had not come since the night her father had announced that she would be married to the merchant from Thung Long. She did not dislike the merchant. That was, in a strange way, part of the problem. If she had hated him, she could have raged and wept and eventually been worn down into acceptance. But she felt nothing toward him except the particular blankness of encountering a person who is entirely unknown to you. And that blankness had, over the weeks since the announcement, quietly filled with something she had no name for. The mountain was 3 days' walk from the valley. She had heard about it all her life. Yentu, the sacred peak where the great king had gone when he gave up his throne. The place where the bamboo forest school had begun, where monks lived in small stone hermitages on the high slopes, and the air tasted different from any air below. Her grandmother had made the pilgrimage once, 40 years ago, and still spoke of it at festival times with a particular quality in her voice, as if the memory had not aged the way ordinary memories age. The Gyongho stream marked the mountain's true beginning. She heard it before she saw it, a cold sound cutting through the heavy forest, quiet. And when she reached the small bridge where pilgrims paused to wash their hands, she knelt and put both palms in the water and felt the cold move up through her wrists and into the center of her chest like something being returned. She did not know why she was here exactly. She knew only that she could not continue to lie in the dark every night, listening to her own mind. The mind was the problem. She understood this even without any teaching. The merchant, the marriage, the future, these things existed in the world in some form, and they were not, in themselves. What kept her awake? What kept her awake was what her mind did with them. It would begin with a single thought, I have never lived anywhere except this valley, and then move. smoothly and with apparent logic. 2. And after the marriage I will live in Thunglong. And then the streets of Thunglong are crowded and loud. And then I will be lonely. And then I will be lonely for the rest of my life. And then this is my one life, and it is already decided. And then what is the point of anything? The whole sequence took perhaps the time required to breathe in and out 3 times. She had run it many hundreds of times in 3 weeks. She ran it differently in the afternoon than at midnight. The daytime version was faster, more clipped. The nighttime version, slow and thorough. Examining each step the way you might examine a wound, but the ending was always the same, empty, arriving at the words, "What is the point of anything?" She reached Hoa Yen Pagoda by mid-morning of the second day, her legs aching from the ancient stone steps that wound up through the pine and bamboo forests, her sandals damp from mountain mist that thickened on the upper slopes into something almost visible. The air itself turned white. The pagoda sat at 534 meters above sea level. She learned this later nestled into the mountainside, where 2 streams joined, and a great pine tree had grown so old that its roots had split the courtyard stones into gentle waves. The pagoda's eaves were carved with lotus and cloud patterns, the paint worn to the warmth of old wood, and the smell inside was sandalwood and cold stone and the sweet decay of many flowers left over many years. She asked one of the resident monks if there was anyone she could speak with. She was not sure what she meant by this. She had no specific question prepared. The monk, an older man who carried a broom everywhere, as though perpetually in the middle of an unfinished task, looked at her for a moment with the uncomplicated attention of someone who has long since stopped judging the people who arrive at their door. He brought her to a woman. This surprised her. She had expected a master, which in her imagination had meant an old man. The woman was perhaps 35, with a face that held no particular expression at rest, but changed completely when animated by attention. She was called Min Shao, which meant clear pearl, and she had been practicing at Yen Tu for 12 years, first as a lay practitioner, and then, after her own husband died, as a fully ordained nun. She was shelling bamboo shoots when Lin arrived, her fingers moving with the efficient affection of someone who finds real pleasure in ordinary work. Lin sat across from her on a low wooden bench in the pagoda's side courtyard. The mist moved through the bamboo beyond the courtyard wall. She explained her situation, the marriage, the merchant, the sleeplessness in the practical, abbreviated way she might explain it to a neighbor. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. Min Shao listened with the broom monk's same quality of uncomplicated attention. When Lin finished, the nun asked a question that seemed entirely beside the point. "In 3 weeks?" she said. "How many times has the marriage actually happened?" Lin looked at her. "It has not happened. It will happen in the spring. And how many times have you suffered because of it?" A pause. "I do not understand the question." "You have suffered every night for 3 weeks," Mingqiu said. It was not unkind, it was simply accurate. That suffering has been quite real. You have felt it in your chest, in your sleep, in your body. But the marriage itself has not yet occurred. So something has been happening in the time between the announcement and the event. Something has been producing the suffering. What do you think it is? Ling was quiet for a long moment. One of the bamboo stalks beyond the courtyard wall creaked as the wind shifted. Far below, through the mist, she could occasionally see the faintest suggestion of the valley she had come from, grey-green and miniature. "My thoughts," she said finally. Min Chao nodded without emphasis, as if this was simply a fact they had established together, no more remarkable than the temperature of the water in the stream. Our great founder taught something he called Fan Quan Tu Ki. She said, looking inward to illuminate oneself, not looking inward to judge or to fix, but to see clearly what is actually present. She set down the bamboo shoot she had been working on. Tell me when the thought comes that says you will be lonely in Thunglong. Is that thought the truth of what will happen? Or is it a story the mind constructs about what might happen? I do not know what will happen, Lin said carefully. No. And yet the mind speaks about it with great certainty, as if it has already visited the future and returned with a complete report. Something in Min Chao's voice was almost gentle. The mind is a devoted storyteller. It works very hard. It takes a single fact: you will move to a new city, and it builds an entire life from that fact. A life that runs all the way to its ending. And then it hands you this life and says, this is what is coming. And you believe it. Because the story feels so real. And because the feelings the story produces, the loneliness, the grief, the fear, are entirely real feelings. The story is imaginary. The feelings it creates are genuine. This is the confusion. Lin found she had stopped breathing in her normal way. She was taking in the nun's words with the slow, careful attention of someone who has been trying to translate something for weeks and has suddenly understood a new word. There is a teaching, Ming Shao continued, from the older tradition that our founder drew from, about what is sometimes called the second arrow. When something difficult happens, a loss, an uncertainty, a pain, it is as if an arrow strikes you. That is the first arrow. It is real. It hurts. You cannot always prevent it. But then the mind immediately fires a second arrow, and a third, and a fourth. Thoughts about what the pain means. Stories about where the pain will lead. Judgments about whether you are handling the pain correctly. Fears about how long the pain will last. Each of these is another arrow, and each one is fired by your own mind, at yourself. In response to the first, she paused. You came here with a wound from one arrow. You have been lying awake each night while your own mind fires many more. The mist shifted. For a moment, the bamboo forest below the courtyard wall was completely obscured, and the world beyond Lin's bench contracted to the small cold square of the courtyard. The pale stone, the old pine roots cracking the floor, the nun's calm hands now still in her lap. How do I make it stop? Lin asked. Ming Zhou smiled then. Briefly, you cannot make it stop by fighting it. Fighting the second arrow is simply firing a fifth arrow. She reached down and picked up the bamboo shoot again. The practice is simpler and harder than fighting. When you notice the mind has begun its story, when you recognize the sequence beginning. I will be lonely. And then you simply notice. You say to yourself, inwardly, there is the story again. Not with contempt, not with despair, just with recognition. The way you might recognize an old neighbor coming down the lane. There is the story again. And then you return to what is actually present. The breath, the stone beneath you, the cold air, the actual moment, which has no marriage in it yet, and no loneliness, and no merchant, only this, only now. Lin stayed at Yentu for 3 more days. She slept, for the first time in weeks, On a thin mat in the small room the nuns kept for women, pilgrims, under a single cotton blanket that smelled of cedar. The mountain wind moving through the high bamboo outside the window with that breathing sound she had noticed on the first day of the climb. She did not solve anything. The marriage was still coming. The merchant was still unknown to her. Thang-long was still distant and loud and foreign. But she had begun to notice just that. Only that. When the thought arose, "I will be lonely," she practiced seeing it as a thought. When the sequence began assembling itself, its pieces clicking into place with their terrible logic, she practiced stepping back one small step and watching the assembly happen rather than living inside it. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes the story carried her anyway for long minutes before she realized she had gone. She came down the mountain on the 5th morning, when the mist was still heavy in the lower bamboo groves and the stone steps were dark with moisture. She passed the Gyongho stream again and did not stop this time, only listened to it as she walked. Cold, clear, moving always forward, not stopping to tell stories about where it had been or where it was going. Just the water. Just the cold sound of moving water on a mountain in early morning. She was not fixed. She was not at peace in any complete or permanent sense. But she carried with her now a small, precise awareness that most of her suffering in 3 weeks had been built from materials her own mind had gathered and assembled in the dark, and that while she could not yet always choose to put down what the mind built, she could learn to see it being built, which was already something, which was, she suspected, the beginning of something, and she breathed, and the path descended, and the valley came back into view below, green and ordinary, exactly as she had left it. Let that land in you now. If you feel thoughts arising about tomorrow, about what was said, about what is still unresolved, you don't need to follow them into the story they want to become. Just notice, there is the story, and return here, to the breath, to the weight of the blanket, to this moment, which is just this moment, requiring nothing of you except to be in it. Nothing to solve tonight. Nothing to prepare for. Just this breath arriving, and the next, and the one after that. And as the mind's storytelling grows quieter now, as the second arrows soften and dissolve, we travel forward in time to meet someone who spent 20 years trying to fix himself, before discovering something could not be fixed because it was never broken. In the autumn of the year that the sickness came to Nyal, the physician Sonam Rinchen made a decision he had been refusing to make for 3 weeks. He had tried everything he knew. He had been a physician since his early 20s, trained in the Indian, Chinese, and Tibetan medical traditions under 30 teachers, a number that other physicians, when they heard it, received with something between respect and faint suspicion. As if a man who had studied with 30 teachers must be searching for something that kept eluding him. He had been his father's apprentice first, learning to read the qualities of a person's pulse, the 28 varieties of pulse described in the Gyushi, the 4 tantras of Tibetan medicine, before he had learned to read letters. He could identify the smell of certain imbalances before a patient entered the room. He had walked to villages in snow and darkness, had delivered children, had sat through the night at bedsides during the long, frightening seasons that came to every family eventually. He had been unable to save his children. He had not been able to save his wife. The epidemic that arrived in Nyal that autumn came without the particular courtesy that illness sometimes showed, a slow warning, a gathering darkness. Time to prepare, It came the way certain storms come, out of a sky that was clear the day before, and it moved through the district with a speed that made the usual medical calculations feel meaningless. By the time Sonam Rinchen had understood what he was dealing with, had identified the particular character of the fever, had read his texts for parallel cases, had sent a student to the city for additional remedies that would not arrive for 2 weeks, his son was already dead. His daughter died 3 days later, just as the remedies arrived. She had been 4 years old. She had liked to steal the dried fruit he kept in a small wooden box on his medical shelf, and pretend she had not done it, and he had pretended not to notice. And this small recurring joke had been, he understood only now, one of the purest forms of joy he had known. His wife, Dawa, fell ill on the same day his daughter did. He treated her with everything he had. He slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check her fever, to adjust the remedies, to read her pulse in the way he had been reading pulses for 20 years, feeling for the thread of life in the quality of that small movement under his fingers. Medicine is, at its deepest level, a kind of listening. This was what his first teacher had told him, and he had believed it, and had built his professional life on it. He listened now with everything in him. He listened with his hands and his knowledge and his eyes and his love, which had never been a small thing. The fever broke on the 12th day. He felt the quality of her pulse shift, felt the terrible tightness in his own chest release, and he went to the corner of the room and sat with his back against the cold stone wall and allowed himself, for the first time in 2 weeks, to not be composed. She recovered enough, over the following days, to sit up, to drink broth, to hold his hand with a grip that was still weaker than it should be, but present, unmistakably present. On the 7th day of her recovery, she asked him to sit beside her. He sat. The room smelled of the herbs he burned at the threshold to keep the sickness from deepening, and of the particular cold and earth smell that comes into mountain houses in autumn when the days shorten. Through the small window, the sky was grey and clean. She told him she was not going to recover fully. He understood from her face that she had decided to tell him this rather than allow him to discover it, which was an act of love he recognized but could not yet receive. She said that she could feel it not with fear, but with a kind of clear knowledge that she trusted more than the improvement in her pulse over the past 3 days. She said she wanted him to promise her something. He began, in the way of physicians and husbands, to disagree with her diagnosis. Suriname. Her voice was quiet but entirely steady. I have watched you practice medicine for 12 years. I have seen you know things about your patients that your patients did not yet know about themselves. You taught me that the body has a knowledge that the mind sometimes refuses. She looked at him without drama, without sentimentality, with the quality of attention he associated with the finest teachers he had studied under. Give me the courtesy of trusting my body's knowledge now. He was quiet for a long time. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and fell silent. What do you want me to promise? He said. Do not marry again, she said. Not because I am possessive. You know I am not. She paused. Because you have been looking for something your whole life that marriage and medicine have not given you. I have watched you reading not just medical texts, but the Dharma books, the teachings, the records of the masters. I have watched you practice the preliminary meditations with the same thoroughness you bring to a difficult diagnosis. You are a man who has always been preparing for something without being willing to name what he is preparing for. She smiled. And it was the smile he had first fallen in love with 12 years ago in his teacher's courtyard. A smile that found everything slightly more interesting than expected. "When I am gone, go find it." She died 10 days later. She had been right. He was 25 years old. He sat in the house for a week, in the particular silence that accumulates after a death has taken the last person who was inside the silence with you. He was not yet grieving in the way grief eventually arrives, the grief that is wet and physical and arrives in waves at unexpected hours. He was in the ante-room of grief, where everything is still and strange, and the ordinary objects of a shared life, the wooden box with the dried fruit, the blanket she preferred because of its weight, the cup she drank tea from in the morning become unbearably specific. On the 8th day he shaved his head and left the house. He became a monk in the Kadampa tradition, under the discipline of the great teacher Geshe Lodan Sherab. And for 7 years he studied everything the tradition had to offer, the Lamrim, the graduated path, the teachings on impermanence and compassion and the nature of mind. He was, as he had always been, an outstanding student. His teachers praised his intelligence, his diligence, his ability to grasp subtle distinctions and hold multiple teachings in relation to each other. He became known in the tradition as someone who was going to do important things. Something remained, however, that all the study did not touch. He noticed it in meditation, a place in the center of his practice that stayed closed, that all his knowledge and discipline circled around but could not enter. He understood the teachings on non-attachment with great precision. He could explain them in detail, in response to any question, from any angle, but understanding them and living from them were, he was discovering, not the same country. He was not attached to his children in the way he had been. That loss had done something, had cracked something open that could not be closed again. He was not attached to his wife in the way he had been, but he had transferred much of what had been attachment to ordinary life into attachment to his practice, to his progress, to his understanding. He was now deeply attached to the idea of not being attached. He understood, in the abstract, that this was its own snare. He had not yet found his way out of it. One afternoon, in the meditation hall of the monastery, he overheard 2 monks talking about a yogi who lived in the high mountains to the west. They spoke his name as if it were the name of something extraordinary, Milarepa, and described, briefly, a teaching the yogi had given about the nature of mind that one of the monks had encountered in a text. Sonam Rinchen sat very still and let the conversation wash over him, and felt something happen in his chest that he recognized from many years of listening to patients describe symptoms as significant. It was a feeling he had no precise medical term for. It was a feeling like arriving at a door you have been searching for without knowing you were searching. He left for the Western Mountains 3 days later. The journey to find Milarepa took weeks. He walked through regions where the altitude made each breath feel like a modest but non-negotiable negotiation with the sky. He slept in small wayfarers' lodges that smelled of yak, butter, and smoke. Ate sampa, roasted barley flour, mixed with the cold water from mountain streams. He was not comfortable. He had not been uncomfortable in quite this way since his early years as a student. And he found, to his mild surprise, that he did not mind it. Each day of the journey felt more honest than the comfort had felt. When he found Milarepa lean and brown as a walnut, living in a cave that contained almost nothing, radiating something that Sonam Rinchen could not name, but recognized as the thing he had been studying toward. For 7 years he offered formal prostrations and presented himself as a student. Milarepa looked at him for a long, completely unhurried moment. "Tell me," the yogi said, "what are you carrying?" Surnam Rinchen understood this was not a question about his pack. He answered honestly, his grief, his knowledge, his practice, his need to understand, his carefully maintained hope that understanding would bring him to the thing he had glimpsed in the brief, clear moments of his deepest meditation. Milarepa listened without interrupting. When Sonam Rinchen finished, the yogi was quiet for a time. Then he said something that Sonam Rinchen would carry for the rest of his long life, would return to in his own teaching again and again, would eventually pass to his students in language they could receive because it was worn smooth by his own long use of it. "You have been trying to arrive at the open hand," Milarepa said. By squeezing more tightly, Sonam Rinchen was quiet. "Everything you understand, you are holding. Everything you have practiced, you are holding. Your grief, even that you are holding, because it has become part of the story of who you are. The physician who lost everything and became a monk and went looking. The story is not wrong. But you cannot enter the open door while your arms are full of it." Outside, the cave mouth, the mountains were enormous in the afternoon light. The high snow fields, the particular blue-white that exists only at altitude, and the sky behind them deep and indifferent and entirely without opinion about any of this. "How?" Sonam Rinchen asked. "Not by dropping things," Milarepa said. "You have been trying to drop things for 7 years and they have not dropped. Dropping is another form of holding. You are still deciding, still managing, still you in relation to the thing." He picked up a small stone from the cave floor and held it in his open palm. When the hand is truly open, the stone rests for a moment and then it is simply gone. Not thrown, not placed somewhere, simply no longer requiring the hand. He closed his palm. He opened it. The stone was gone. "The letting go you are looking for is not an action," Milarepa said. "It is a recognition. You recognize that the hand was never really closed. The grief was never really stuck. The knowledge was never really yours to hold or lose. And in that recognition, something releases that was never actually held, only believed to be held." Sonam Rinchen sat in the mouth of that cave for 3 years. He became Milarepa's most important student. He eventually founded the great monastery at Dakla Gampo and taught thousands of students and wrote the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, one of the most celebrated texts in all of Tibetan Buddhism. His teaching style was known for its particular quality, the unusual combination of rigorous scholarly precision with a warmth that his students described as coming from someone who had suffered real loss and found something real on the other side of it. He was known throughout his life as Dakpo Haje, the physician from Dakpo. He had never, not even after all those years, entirely stopped being a doctor. He had only expanded what he understood medicine to mean. Feel that now, if you can. The thing you are holding that you have been trying to put down, the grief, the worry, the plan, the version of yourself that depends on things going a certain way. You have been trying to drop it, and it has not dropped. What if you are not required to drop it? What if it requires only that the hand become not forcibly opened, not made to release, but simply recognized as already, in its deepest nature? Open? The hand has always been open. The holding has been a habit of attention, not a fact of the hand. Let the breath be what it is. Let the body settle into the surface beneath it. Nothing gripped. Nothing forced into stillness. Just this open moment, requiring nothing. Let your eyes close, if they haven't already. The night is long and entirely yours. And as that deep releasing continues, gentle as snow coming to rest on a mountain, we travel now to find a woman who spent 30 years believing the storm in her mind was what she was, until a single morning showed her otherwise. In the dry season of 1921, in a village along the banks of the Chindwin River in Upper Burma, a woman named Do Tin Sein decided to go and sit with the old teacher one more time before she grew any older. She was 53 years old, and she had been weaving silk for 31 of those years. Her loom stood against the eastern wall of her house, in the room where the morning light came in first, and the particular clatter and rhythm of it, the shuttle moving through the warp, the baton swinging, the shed changing under her feet, had become so deeply woven into her days that she could not always say where the weaving ended and she began. Her silk was known in 3 markets. The patterns she designed were intricate and original, drawing on traditions she had learned from her grandmother and modified over decades into something entirely her own. People came from distant towns to commission work from her. She had 2 daughters who were well. She had a husband, Maung Kin, who was a gentleman with a dry sense of humor and hands that had become over 40 years of woodwork, as textured as old teak. She had a house that was solid and clean and smelled in the evenings of jasmine from the vine she had trained up the west wall. She could not sleep. The sleeplessness had begun 2 years ago, when her eldest daughter's first child had been born ill. The child had recovered, was now a healthy, unremarkable 2-year-old who ate dirt and chased the chickens with the focused dedication of someone engaged in serious research, but the fear that had arrived during those weeks had not entirely left. It had changed shape. It had become, over time, less a fear about the specific child and more a kind of ambient dread that attached itself to whatever was currently most precious: her daughter's health, the quality of her husband's cough last winter, the rumors of political instability from the cities, the question of whether the rains would come fully this year or partially, the matter of her own aging body, the increasing certainty that everything she loved would, one day, cease. She was not, she understood, a foolish woman. She knew that everything changed. She had known this all her life. It was in the Buddhist teachings she had grown up hearing, in the impermanence that any person over 50 carries as an intimate companion. She knew it. But knowing it and being free of the particular ache it produced when she lay awake at 2 in the morning were, she had discovered, 2 entirely different things. She had heard about the teacher from her younger daughter, who had attended one of the small instruction sessions the teacher held for laypeople in the nearby market town. The teacher's name was Saya Po, a loose-limbed, the cheerful man in his late 40s who had studied under students of the great Ledi Sayadaw, whose books and teachings on insight meditation had been spreading through Burma for a generation. Saya Po was not a monk. He was a rice farmer who had taken up meditation practice seriously in his late 20s, had sat retreats at the forest monasteries, had eventually received permission from his teachers to instruct laypeople in the basics of vipassana. He taught in a room behind the tea shop on market days, to anyone who arrived. Do Tin Sein had been once, 8 months ago, and had found the experience confusing. She had been instructed to observe the rising and falling of her abdomen as she breathed, and to note, when her attention wandered, where it had gone, and then return. It had seemed, the first time, entirely too simple to help with anything. She had gone home and tried it for a week and then stopped. Because the problem was not her attention. The problem was everything she was afraid of losing. But she went back now because the sleeplessness had worsened and she had run out of other ideas. She brought her youngest daughter's face to mind. The way you bring a lantern when entering a dark room. And she walked the 3 miles to the market town in the early morning, when the air was still cool and smelled of river mud and wood smoke from the cooking fires. Saya Po received her in the small room. There were 2 other students already seated on mats, a young man who farmed rice, a woman of perhaps 60 who appeared to be asleep but was, Dortin Zine would learn, in a particularly deep state of attention. A stick of incense burned before a small image of the Buddha. The wooden walls of the room had absorbed years of this scent, sandalwood and something like old earth. She told Saya Po what had kept her awake. She told him about the child, about the fear that had stayed after the fear had reason to leave, about the way it attached itself to new objects with the efficiency of something that had learned to travel light. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "Tell me about your weaving," he said. She looked at him. "I came to ask about my fear." "Yes, and I'm asking about your weaving." He said it pleasantly, without impatience. "When you are working, when the shuttle is moving and the pattern is building, what do you notice about the thread?" She considered this. It was not a question she had been asked before. "Each thread is separate," she said slowly. "Each pass of the shuttle lays one more. You cannot force the cloth to be finished faster than it is. You lay one thread, then the next, and if you tried to place all the threads at once, you cannot. You would have a tangle, not cloth." He nodded. "What you are describing, the thread, one by one, in sequence, is what the teachings call anicca, impermanence, not a philosophy, a direct observation. Each thread arises, is placed, and is gone as a separate moment. The next thread has no memory of the last one. The cloth only exists as a whole in the mind that watches it accumulate." He paused. "Your fear is doing something different from your hands. Your hands understand that cloth can only be made one thread at a time. Your fear is trying to hold all the threads at once, every moment that might go wrong, every loss that might come, every thread of the future cloth of your life. And of course it cannot hold them. And the trying is what exhausts you." Dortin Sign sat with this for a moment. Outside, the market had begun to fill. She could hear the particular mixture of sounds that markets make everywhere, bargaining voices, the clink of scales, the creak of cartwheels on packed earth. "You are asking me to not care about what happens to my daughters," she said. He shook his head. "I am asking you to see clearly what is actually present in each moment. Caring about your daughters is present right now. That is real. The fear of things that have not happened is a story the mind runs ahead to write. When you sit and observe your breath, you are not learning not to care. You are learning to see the difference between what is actually here and what the mind adds to what is here." He instructed her again in the practice, the same instructions as before, but heard now differently. The way the same piece of cloth can look entirely different in different light. Observe the breath. When the mind moves to a thought, note it, thinking, and return. Not with force, not with judgment. With the same patient attention you bring when you lay a thread, this one, then the next one. She sat for an hour. What happened in that hour was not dramatic. The fear did not depart. Her daughters did not become less precious to her. The future did not become less unknown. But something shifted in her relationship to the content of her mind, a small but real shift. Like the moment in weaving when the pattern you have been working toward finally becomes visible in what has been made, and you understand that it has been building all along, though you could not see it yet. She noticed that a thought arose. The thought was, "My daughter's husband has a soft chest, and this is the kind of man who will not grow old." This was a thought she had had many times, in many forms. Normally, it led directly to the next thought. Then my daughter will be alone, and the next, and the next. The whole thread pulling until she was awake at 2 a.m, at the far end of a sequence that had begun with a single observation about a man's physique. But here, in this small room with the incense and the other sitters, she watched the thought arise. She noted it, thinking, and then, not by effort, but simply by having seen it as a thought rather than as the truth, it was gone. It had moved through her like a single shuttle pass. It had not become a cloth. She sat for another 30 minutes in something she would not, that day, have called peace. She would have called it noticing, but the noticing had a quality of spaciousness she had not felt in 2 years. And when she walked home along the river path in the late morning, with the light on the Chindwin turning it, the particular copper of Burmese rivers at mid-morning, she found that she was simply walking. The path was there, and her feet on it, and the warm smell of the river, and the sound of birds. She had passed on this path 1,000 times without hearing. She was not cured of sleeplessness that afternoon. She sat with the practice for many months before the nights became more consistently quiet. But what had opened in that hour was something she returned to again and again in the years that followed. The way she returned to the loom each morning, patiently, without expectation, willing to lay one thread, and then the next. Not the whole cloth at once. Never the whole cloth at once. The cloth cannot be made that way. The cloth can only be made the way the cloth is made: one pass, one breath, one moment laid gently beside the last, until you look up from the work and find that something beautiful has accumulated without your having forced it into being. Feel that now. You have been trying, perhaps, to hold the whole cloth, all the threads at once. Every tomorrow, every what if, every person you love, and everything you cannot protect. What if tonight, you only need to hold this moment, this breath arising, this one, and then the next. When it comes, the cloth of your life is still being made. It has been being made all along, and it doesn't need your fear to hold it together. It only needs your gentle attention, thread by thread, moment by moment. Let the night be one thread at a time. Let this breath be enough. If you drift off before the next thought arrives, that is perfect. That is more than perfect. That is the cloth knowing how to make itself. And softly now, like the last light fading on the river, we travel to one more story carried on the same gentle current, to a place where a very old monk sat on a mountain and stopped needing to be anything at all. In the spring of 1672, in the castle town of Himeji in Harima province, a man named Inoue Sobe sat in the back row of a very large crowd and tried to become invisible. He was 41 years old. He was wearing merchant's clothing, plain dark cotton. Nothing to distinguish him from the rice sellers and fabric traders and lacquerware dealers who filled the temple grounds around him. He had been wearing merchant's clothing for 3 years now, ever since his stipend had been reduced to nothing and his lord had quietly released him from service, along with 30 other low-ranking samurai who were no longer economically viable in a Japan that had not fought a serious war in 60 years. He was officially, formally, and irrevocably a chonin, now a townsperson, a merchant of modest means who dealt in dry goods and occasional contracts with the daimyo's household administrators. He hated it. Not the work itself, particularly. The work was manageable. He was organized, reliable, honest in his dealings, and he had, to his own surprised discovery, a reasonable head for the mathematics of commerce. His wife was relieved. His children were fed. His house was small but solid. What he hated was himself in it. What he hated was the particular quality of his own attention when he walked through the market. When he bowed to men he had once considered his inferiors. When he noticed his hand moving reflexively toward a sword hilt he no longer wore and correcting itself into an empty gesture. A kind of phantom limb of status that ghosted through him a dozen times a day. He was not the sword. He had never really believed he was the sword, but in the absence of it, some question had arrived that he could not locate or answer. If not the sword, then what? If not samurai, then who was Inoue Sobe? He had heard about the teacher Bankei Yotaku from a fabric merchant named Matsuda who supplied cotton to the same administrator Sobe worked with. Matsuda was a cheerful, unsentimental man who had the peculiar quality of seeming entirely comfortable in his own skin, not aggressive about it, not performing ease, but simply, evidently, at home in himself, in a way that Sobe found baffling and vaguely irritating. He had asked Matsuda about it once, directly, because he was that kind of person. Matsuda had laughed and said he had heard the old teacher speak 3 years ago and something had shifted that had never shifted back. This was not the kind of answer that satisfied Sobe's samurai-trained mind, which preferred causes to have proportional effects and teachings to be learnable. But he had come anyway, because 3 years of not sleeping well and walking around feeling like a costume someone else had stepped out of had eroded his preferences somewhat. The teacher was seated on a simple wooden platform at the edge of the temple grounds. He was 69 years old and looked exactly like someone's grandfather, compact, relaxed, with bright eyes that moved easily across the crowd without appearing to settle on any individual. He was not wearing anything extraordinary. He was simply present in the way that occasionally very old trees are present, not asserting anything, not requiring anything, simply occupying space in a manner that made the space feel different. Bankei began without ceremony. He said, "I want to ask you something. When someone behind you calls your name suddenly, what happens before you turn?" The crowd was quiet. Sobe found himself thinking about this involuntarily. The teacher said, "You turn." Something turns. But before the thought, before you know it, is you being called. Before you decide to respond, there is already turning. Who turns before you decide to turn? He let this sit for a moment the way you let tea sit before drinking it. The mind that hears clearly before you have decided to listen. Bankei said, "The mind that sees before you have decided to look. This is the unborn. This is the Buddha mind that each of you was born with and that none of you has ever lost for even a single moment. No matter what you have done or failed to do, no matter what has been taken from you or what you have had to give up." Sobai felt something tighten in his chest at the words taken from you. The teacher seemed to look in his direction, though probably he was looking at someone else. This mind, Bunkei said, was not born samurai. It was not born merchant. It does not wear a sword. It does not keep accounts. When you were a small child, before you knew your name or your father's name or your class or your duties, what were you? You were this. You have been this all along. Underneath every role and every loss and every reinvention. The role changes. The unborn does not change. The sky does not change when clouds pass through it. Sobai had heard this kind of teaching before. He had sat in temple halls where monks explained impermanence with great technical authority and then filed back to their meals. He had read enough Buddhist texts to understand the theory. He knew the theory. The theory did nothing for him at 2 in the morning when the phantom sword hand twitched. He was preparing to be somewhat bored when an old farmer near the front raised his hand and asked a question that Sobai recognized immediately. With the particular shock of recognition that arrives when someone else perfectly articulates something you have been circling for years without finding language for it. The farmer said, "Teacher, I understand about the unborn. But my body is old and painful, and I am afraid of dying. When I try to rest in this mind you describe, the fear comes, and I cannot find the mind underneath it. The fear is all there is." Bankei smiled, not the smile of someone about to explain why the question was mistaken, but the smile of someone who genuinely appreciated the company of a good question. He said, "Who is afraid?" The farmer said, "I am." "And who is noticing the fear?" The farmer was quiet. "The one who notices the fear," Bankei said, "is not inside the fear. You cannot see something you are. You can only see something you are looking at. Right now, fear is arising in the body and the mind. Something is watching the fear arise. That something is it a ferment?" The farmer said. Slowly, "No." Bankei nodded. "That is the one. That is what you are looking for. You have been so busy looking at the fear that you have not noticed the one looking. The looker was never afraid. The looker has never been afraid. Even now, as the fear is there, and it is there. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. The one who is aware of the fear is quiet, still, unchanged by what it sees." Sobai sat with this for a long time. The crowd breathed around him. Someone coughed. A child was carried out by a patient mother. The spring afternoon moved above the temple roof, and somewhere a bush warbler called twice and then was silent. He thought about the mornings when he walked to the merchant district to open his small shop. He thought about the way he watched himself walking, watched himself with a kind of exhausted, critical attention, the way an instructor watches an incompetent student, noting every failure of posture, every lapse of former dignity, every moment where he fell short of a standard that technically no longer applied to him. He had been watching himself fail to be samurai for 3 years. He had been completely occupied with watching. But who was watching? He thought, that is a strange question. I am watching. But then who is watching the watcher? That thought began to spiral in a way that felt like it might become vertiginous. And he stopped it, and sat with the simpler thing Bankei had said. The one who is noticing is not inside what it notices. He could not argue with that. Even now, sitting here, his discomfort was present, the hardness of the ground, the slightly too warm afternoon, the old shame like a stone behind his sternum. But something was watching all of it. Something was watching the shame. That something was not ashamed. He could not hold this for long. It slipped. His attention moved to a memory of being 19 and receiving his post and feeling the particular quality of clean usefulness that had come with the sword and the service. And then the memory of the afternoon 3 years ago when the administrator had told him, with genuine regret, that his stipend was to be discontinued. And the shame came back like something physical. But then something watched that too. The shame was seen. The memory was seen. Even the grief about the loss was seen by something that was not grieving. He did not become enlightened that afternoon. He did not have a dramatic revelation that resolved his 3 years of quiet anguish. He went home and made dinner and slept poorly and opened his shop the next morning and caught himself reaching for the phantom sword twice before noon. But something had changed in the quality of his watching. He noticed, over the following weeks, that when the shame arose, the phantom samurai feeling, the sense of fallen status, the reflexive comparison between who he was and who he had been there was, alongside it, and subtler than it, a watching, something that was not performing, something that was not comparing, something that had apparently been there all along, quietly noting the whole performance without participating in it. He went back to hear Bankei speak twice more before the old teacher left Himeji. On the second visit, he waited after the crowd dispersed and asked, very directly, the way samurai ask things, "Master, this watcher I have found. Is it me?" Bankei looked at him for a moment with those easy, unhurried eyes. Then he said, "Is the sky the cloud?" Sobei said, "No." "Is the sky less itself for having clouds?" Sobei said, "No." "Is it more itself when the clouds are gone?" He thought about this. Then, "No." Bankei said, "Then you understand already. The sky does not become something by having clouds or not having clouds. The sky is the sky before the first cloud and after the last one. You are not the samurai feeling. You are not the merchant feeling. You are not the shame. You are not the grief. You were here before any of those, quietly, and you will be here after. This is what is meant by unborn. It was not born when you were born. It was not damaged when your stipend was taken. It was not elevated when you wore the sword. It has simply been watching, always watching, impartial as sky." Sobei bowed. The bow came from somewhere different than his samurai bows had come from, not from duty, not from social code, not from trained reflex. It came from something that felt, briefly, like gratitude from a place that had no name. He was still a merchant. He still occasionally reached for the phantom sword. He still, on difficult days, felt the particular heaviness of a life that had turned in a direction he had not chosen. But alongside all of it, and beneath all of it, he had found something that none of it touched. Not because it was distant or detached or beyond caring, it was not. He cared about his family. He cared about his work. He cared about the quiet grace that had once been part of his life and that he was, slowly, finding the beginning threads of in this new one. But the carer was not made of what it cared about. The watcher was not made of what it watched. And in that small but genuine space between what arose and what witnessed its arising, there was something that no stipend, no sword, no status could give or take away. Just that. Just the awareness before the role. Just the sky before the cloud is named. And here, right now, something in you recognizes this. Not as a new idea, as a remembered fact. The part of you that is listening to these words is not asleep. not anxious, not reviewing the day's events. Something is simply aware, present, quiet in a way that has nothing to do with whether the room is quiet. Feel that awareness right now, not as something you are reaching for, as something you are already resting inside. You are not your thoughts right now. You are the sky in which they move. You are not the tension in your shoulders. You are the awareness that can feel the tension. You are not the name of what you are worrying about. You are the space in which the worry appeared. And that space, you may notice, is quite large. Larger than the worry. Larger than the day. Old as sky. The thoughts may continue. They are allowed. Clouds are allowed. But you are not required to be them. You never were. You were the sky all along. And this night, and this room, and this darkness, and this breath, they all arise inside you, the vast and unborn one. Let the role go quiet. Let the name go quiet. Let what was never born simply rest in its own nature, which is rest itself. And as that sky mind grows still and wide and welcoming of everything that passes through it, we travel now to one last story softer than all the others, meant for the part of you that no longer needs to understand, only to rest. In the ancient ironwood forest of Kurunegala, in the hill country of central Sri Lanka, there lived a very old monk named Jnanasara. He had been in the forest for 51 years. He had arrived as a young man of 22, having studied Pali in Colombo for 3 years and sat with teachers in Kandy and Matara, and had walked the last 12 miles to the forest hermitage on a morning so wet and fragrant that the rain seemed less like weather than like the forest breathing. He had a young man's urgency then, the particular quality of wanting that is always slightly ahead of itself, always pointing towards some future state in which everything would be resolved and the question he could not name would finally have its answer. He was 73 now. The urgency had been gone for a long time. He no longer remembered precisely when it had left, which seemed right. He had not noticed its departure, only its absence. The way you notice one morning that a sound that had been present for years is simply no longer there, and you cannot say when the silence began. His kuti, his small dwelling, sat at the edge of a clearing in the forest, beneath 3 ancient ironwood trees whose trunks were so old and massive that their bark had developed a texture like crumpled cloth, and whose canopy reached so high that in the middle of the day a particular quality of light came through, not golden exactly, but something without a better name. A light that seemed to arrive having passed through so many layers of green that it had absorbed something of the forest's patience. He was not famous. He had never written books or given large teachings. A few monks had studied with him over the decades. They came. They stayed some months or years. They left carrying something he could not name, and they did not try to describe. A few lay families from the nearby village came occasionally with food, rice, and vegetable curry, offered with the kind of quiet respect that in Sri Lankan Buddhist culture does not require explanation or reciprocation. He woke each morning before the birds. He swept the path from his kuti to the meditation walk with a handmade broom of ironwood twigs. He walked in meditation as the forest woke around him, first the single loud shout of a jungle fowl from somewhere to the east, then the gradual layering of other bird voices as the light strengthened, then the monkeys beginning their day with a quality of vocal complaint that he had spent decades noticing was really more conversational than distressed. He ate once a day. He sat in the afternoon. In the evening he sat again, and the forest settled around him as it always had, as it would continue to do after him. He was not, as far as he could tell, close to dying. His body was old, but not dramatically failing. The knees had been a matter of patient attention for 20 years. The eyesight had thinned. There was occasionally a pain in the left shoulder that he had examined closely enough to understand as sensation rather than threat. He had sat with enough to know that the difference between the two was not in the sensation itself, but in how the mind received it. On this particular evening, a November evening, the short rains having ended 2 days before, leaving the forest with that particular after-rain quality of heightened smell and deepened color, he sat outside his kuti on a low wooden platform and watched the night arrive. This was his practice for the evening, not formal sitting, not directed attention, but simply this: watching the night arrive. He had done it for decades, and it had never become ordinary, which seemed to him one of the more quietly remarkable things about being alive, that a thing could be done 10,000 times and retain, if approached without demand, the quality of being encountered for the first time. The sky above the clearing was still pale where the sun had been. The ironwood trees were dark shapes against it. A single bat crossed the open space with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for something moving on the edge of visibility. Somewhere in the forest to his left, water was moving over stones, a small stream he could not see from here. Only here, a sound that in 51 years had become as familiar as his own breathing and as inexplicably comforting. He was not thinking about anything in particular. This was perhaps the thing that would have been most difficult to explain to the young man who had arrived 51 years ago, in the rain, not the practice, not the discipline, not even the solitude, but this, the quality of a mind that has stopped insisting on itself, not empty, not blank, not withdrawn into some internal distance, simply present, without agenda, like water in a bowl that reflects whatever is above it without choosing. A young monk had come to visit that afternoon, traveling from a monastery in Kandy. He had been practicing for 2 years and was in the particular stage that Yanasara recognized, the stage where one has tasted something real in practice, and the tasting has produced a tremendous wanting more, a kind of spiritual restlessness that burns with genuine intention, but sometimes scorches the very ground it is trying to cultivate. The young monk had asked him directly, "Venerable, how do I stop fighting with my mind?" Yanasara had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "Show me the fighter." The young monk had looked puzzled. "You said your mind and you are fighting. I would like to see both the fighter and the thing being fought. Show me separately." The young monk had been quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I cannot separate them." Yanasara nodded. "This is what you are discovering. There is no fighter and no thing being fought. There is only the fighting. And when you look very closely at the fighting, you discover that it is made of the same material as the rest of experience it arises. It is present for a time, and then it passes. The suffering in the fighting is not the fighting itself. It is the belief that the fighting must stop before you are allowed to rest." He offered the young monk tea. They sat for a while in a silence that was companionable rather than instructive. When the young monk left at dusk, he bowed in the way that people bow when something has shifted slightly and they are not yet sure what it was. Now the evening had moved into full dark. The ironwood trees were silhouettes, then darkness, then simply presences felt rather than seen. The stream continued its patient commentary from somewhere to the left. Insects had begun their night work, the particular layered sound of a Sri Lankan forest at night that Yanasara could not have described to someone who had not heard it. A sound that was simultaneously many things and one thing, like a chord rather than a note. He was not reviewing the day. He was not preparing for tomorrow. The young monk's visit passed through his awareness the way a bird passes through the clearing present, then gone, leaving the space unchanged. He noticed the temperature of the air against his forearms. Cool now, after the rain. The particular quality of forest air at night, which carries the smell of earth and bark and something living that has no name, the smell, perhaps, of growth itself, slow and ongoing and entirely indifferent to whether any particular observer is present to receive it. He noticed the breath. He had been noticing the breath in this forest for 51 years. It had not become less interesting. Each breath was its own complete event arising without announcement, moving through the body with a quality of arrival, departing without remainder. He had spent years observing this as practice and had arrived somewhere beyond practice, somewhere where the observation had become so natural that it was less like watching and more like being the breath's witness without trying to be. He was tired in the body and awake in the awareness behind the body. This distinction, which would have seemed like a philosophical point to the young monk he had been, was by now as simple and self-evident as the difference between the water in the bowl and the bowl itself. The tiredness was in the bowl. The awareness was the water. He noticed he was thinking this, and noticed the thought was unnecessary, and let it pass without contempt. Because contempt would have been another unnecessary thought. Somewhere far to the east, a night bird called twice, then was silent. The call had the quality of something said perfectly and not in need of repetition. He did not know the name of the bird. He had never learned the names of the birds in this forest, having found early on that names created a kind of distance from the actual creature, that the moment one labeled something, one stopped quite so clearly experiencing it. The unnamed bird calling in the darkness was far more present to him as a sound than it would have been as a tuk-tuk or a crested hawk-eagle or any other label by which the forest could be organized into knowable categories. He was simply here. The forest was simply here. The night was doing what the night does, with or without witnesses. On this hill, as on every other hill. In this forest, as in every other forest. On this night, as on every night, since the first tree grew toward the first light. He was not separate from this. He was not merged with it either, in any way that required dissolving or being absorbed or losing the quiet knowing that sat at the center of his experience like a lamp that does not go out when the room grows dark. He was simply continuous with it. The way water is continuous with the ocean, it is part of, distinct enough to be experienced as itself, connected enough to rest. Nothing was required of him right now. This was perhaps, he had come to understand, the deepest teaching, not as a concept, but as a direct, lived fact. Nothing was required. Not peace, because peace was already present. Not stillness, because stillness was the nature of awareness itself. Not even the watching, because the watching happened on its own. He had arrived somewhere that had no further destination, not because the journey had ended, but because the idea that there was somewhere else to be had simply, gradually, without fanfare, ceased to be convincing. He would sleep soon. His body knew how to sleep the way trees know how to be in rain, not because of any decision, but because that is what bodies do. And the thing in him that was not his body would simply remain, quietly, as it always had, through sleeping and waking and sleeping again, through all the nights of 51 years and through whatever nights remained, and through the final night that was also just a night, also just the darkness doing what the darkness does. He breathed in the forest smell one more time. or the smell arrived in him. He was no longer certain of the direction. The bat crossed the clearing again, or a different bat, and was gone. The stream continued. The insects continued. The ironwood trees stood as they had stood before he arrived and would stand after he was gone, patient and enormous, and entirely without opinion about any of it. And here, now, something in you has traveled a long way tonight, through many stories and many lives and many teachings that were really all one teaching, turning itself over like water over stones, finding different surfaces in different light. You do not need to hold any of it. The stories have already done their work. The wisdom has already moved, where wisdom moves not into the thinking mind, but into the place underneath thinking. The place that was listening before you knew you were listening. The place that will continue when the listening is finished. Let your body be as heavy as it wishes to be. Let the breath breathe itself, as it has been doing since your first moment and will do now without your help. The darkness in this room is the same darkness that lay over that forest in Sri Lanka. The same night that held that old monk on his platform holds you here, in your bed, in this moment. You don't need to remember anything from tonight. You don't need to understand anything. You don't need to become anything. You are here. That is already complete. That is already everything. Just here. Just this. Just the breathing. Just the weight of the body. Just the darkness receiving you as it receives everything without condition, without preference, without end. Let the eyes close if they have not closed already. Let the hands rest as they are. Let the name you carry go quiet for a while. Something older than your name, more patient than your questions, wider than your worries, is already resting, has always been resting, here, underneath everything. You are allowed to join it now. The forest continues. The stream continues. The breath continues. And you, gently, gratefully, are already drifting, already held, already home. Tonight you traveled far. You sat with a Korean master locked in a small room until his mind showed him what silence actually is. You rested on the bank of a Thai river and learned that thinking and the one who watches thinking were never the same thing. You stood on a Chinese mountain while water taught a young monk something that words could not. You climbed a Vietnamese mountain in the dark and found that most suffering lives in the story the mind builds around what hasn't happened yet. You sat in a Tibetan cave and understood that letting go is not an action but a recognition to the hand discovering it was already open. You watched a Burmese woman at her loom and learned to lay one thread at a time instead of grasping for the whole cloth. You sat in a Japanese temple courtyard and heard a merchant understand, for the first time, that he was not the role, that the sky was never the cloud, and you rested. Finally, in an ancient ironwood forest where an old monk no longer needed anything to be different than it was. 8 lives. 8 moments of seeing clearly. And underneath all of them, one teaching, turning over and over in different light. You are not your thoughts. You are the space in which they move. You are not your worry. You are the awareness that watches the worry, unchanged. You are not what you are afraid of losing. You are something older, something that was never in danger, something that has been watching quietly from the very beginning. Just this open, unhurried awareness. Just this. If any insight from tonight finds its way into your days, it will come quietly, not as a memory of stories, but as a small moment of space where there used to be only reaction. A breath before the old pattern. A recognition. That is enough. That is more than enough. If this kind of night has brought you something, consider sharing it alike. A subscription, so others who are lying awake right now might find their way here too. That small gesture plants a quiet light in someone else's darkness. And now nothing left to carry. Nothing left to understand. The forest is still. The river is still. The sky holds everything and requires nothing. You are held. You are enough. You are already home. Sleep well, dear one. Sleep well.